Clear distinction. The rights we're talking about don't differ between citizens, permanent residents, people who are here on temporary visas, or even people who are here without documentation. The United States Constitution guarantees rights against unlawful search and seizure to everyone, regardless of their legal status in the country. There will be some circumstances where rights differ, but we'll be very clear about what those are.
The next important thing to remember is, as Peter said, you have the right to remain silent. So you do not have to answer any question that the FBI asks you. This is really important because when you consent to an interview with the FBI, it's basically like you're under oath, like in a courtroom. Anything that you say to an officer could be recorded, or they could take notes about it, and it could later show up in your file, it could show up in your immigration proceedings. They can, and often do, use statements that you've made against you. So if you're asked a question that you feel uncomfortable about or that you don't know the precise answer to, we advise that you not answer it, or that the next sort of segment of this is that you only give these kind of interviews in the presence of an attorney. One exception to the right to remain silent is if an officer stops you on the street, for example, and asks you simply to identify yourself. There, your rights are a little bit limited because you can be required to at least present identification, but you don't have to subject yourself to any questioning. And again, here's one distinction, one caveat. For non-citizens, it's important to remember that you are required to carry proof of your immigration status. So if you're a green card holder, you must always carry your green card with you. So one thing that, again, FBI interviews are completely, entirely voluntary, and we often say that in some circumstances, it's actually better not to give the interviews. In some circumstances, maybe you want to, and that's fine. But if you do, it's very important to have an attorney present because, as I said, what you say is basically could be recorded or could later be used against you. And so it's very important to seek legal advice. And the ACLU, as well as the Council on American Islamic Relations, provide representation in FBI interviews for free. So if you get a visit from the FBI, you should immediately call us or call CARE and ask for us to help, because we will do that and we'll do it for free. And we'll also discuss with you, the options that you might have. You may think, I'm not really sure if I want to give this interview. I have some information about this particular subject they want to ask me about, that I want to be helpful, but I don't know how it could harm me. And so you can call us, and we'll help you assess whether that's something that you should do or not. The next thing that's important to know is that you always have the right to set the terms and conditions of the interview. So that means that you have the right to decide when you want to talk to them, where you want to talk to them, and what questions you want to answer. People often make the mistake of thinking that first, that they have to give the interview, and second, that they have to go to the FBI's office. Well, if you go to the FBI's office, then you're definitely on their terms. They're setting the terms of the interview. They're on their home territory, and so then they could videotape you, they could record you, they could bring in other officers and use more sort of coercive tactics. It's better for you to choose the place that you feel comfortable in. Ideally in your lawyer's office, at the ACLU office, or some neutral place where you can give the interview on your own terms. And again, you have the right to refuse to answer any questions that they ask you that you feel uncomfortable about. Sometimes they'll say, we want to talk to you only about your trip to Pakistan. But when you get into the interview, it turns out that not only do they want to talk to you about the trip to Pakistan, but they want to talk to you about your neighbors, about your family members, about other things that didn't have anything to do with the subject of the interview that they originally set forth. And so those are particularly the types of things where you would want to push back and say, look, what is this about? I'm not here for a fishing expedition. I'm here to answer a particular question about information that you said you wanted. I'm not going to answer questions about my family members or whatever the subject might be. Some of the risks associated with consenting to these voluntary interviews is that anything you, as I said, anything you say to a federal agent is can be used against you. It's considered as if you've taken an oath almost. And so when you, even lying to a federal agent is considered a crime. And what's happened in some cases is, even if you, and this is part of the reason why we say it's so important to have an attorney present if you give one of these interviews, is that it's very easy to say something that you think is true, but you actually haven't really thought it carefully through, and or your statement could be misperceived to mean something else, and then later that can be turned around and used against you. And so you haven't necessarily lied, but maybe you made a misstatement or you said something that wasn't exactly accurate. They can then turn that around and make it seem like you lied. One example of this to be aware of is in the case of Ahmed Niazi, which and maybe some of you are familiar with, someone who was basically befriended by an informant working for the FBI, later was charged with a bunch of things. One of those things was fraud in his naturalization application. And in the naturalization application, he had answered a question saying that he had traveled to Afghanistan in something like in 2004, when really he had traveled in 2005. And on the basis of that, a very simple mistake. You ask me my travel history, I definitely cannot tell you the exact dates that I traveled places. But because on the basis of that, they were able to charge him with fraud. So this is another sort of cautionary tale for why it's so important, if you are going to consent to an interview like this, to have an attorney present to make sure that everything you say is 100% correct. So what should you do if the FBI comes to your house or comes to your workplace? Well, first of all, I would say, please pick up, I think Musavi has a big stack of my cards. Take my card and carry it with you, and you can use that as your shield, basically. If they come to your house, you give them the card, you say, I'm happy to talk to you, or maybe you're not happy to talk to them, but talk to my attorney and we'll get back to you. And just hand them the card and they'll go away. One thing that, assuming you do that, you say, thank you for your visit, but talk to my attorney. Then when you call me and tell me that they've come to your house, I'll call the FBI agent and find out what the interview is about. And that's one way in which we can control the interview, because sometimes, these interviews can become fishing expeditions where they're just asking lots of questions about lots of things that don't seem to be important. But if we can get them to say that it's only about this one thing, we're only going to ask you about this one thing, then we can control the interview that way. A couple important things to know. One thing is you should never invite an agent into your house. And sometimes this is a hard thing to remember, because when someone comes to your door, you want to be gracious, and especially in certain cultures, it's the polite thing to do to invite someone in, sit down, have a cup of tea. But that's opening yourself up to a situation where you are then going to be subjected to questioning that you didn't necessarily want to be subjected to. So always find out who the agent is, what agency they're from, if it's the FBI or if it's Immigration and Customs Enforcement or if it's the police. Get their card, tell them that your lawyer will contact them, but do not invite them into your house. And remember that if the FBI comes to you, it's not because you've done something wrong. So even though, when anybody from law enforcement seeks us out, it's intimidating, and it makes you think like there's something that you've done wrong. Remember that it doesn't mean that. It means that they are patrolling, that they're looking for information about something that they think that you might have, but it doesn't mean that they're focusing their investigation on you, and most often they're not. I think I'll turn it over to Peter.
I just wanted to add one thing on that, and maybe follow up with a question. Do we know how many thousands of FBI interviews have been conducted since September 11th, 2001?
I don't.
Yeah, I mean, tens of thousands, in fact. One of the former FBI agents, I believe, Ed Rollins or Michael Rollins, if I'm not mistaken, who had confirmed that one of the convention that more than 100,000 interviews have been conducted by FBI.